There is a detail Tanya Tucker mentioned recently that is easy to pass over. She was living close enough to a Nashville venue that, under ordinary circumstances, going to see Andrea Bocelli should have required little more than leaving her building and crossing the street. But she did not go. According to Tanya, she was too sick. That does not mean she was hospitalized that night. She did not describe an ambulance, an emergency room, or some dramatic scene behind closed doors. The exact date of the missed concert was not emphasized either. What she described was quieter than that, and perhaps more revealing. A woman who had spent most of her life traveling from city to city could not manage that small distance. At 67, Tanya has said she has been dealing with Lyme disease and the Epstein-Barr virus. Both can affect people differently, and she has not released a complete medical record or provided a detailed timeline of every symptom, so there are limits to what anyone outside her family can honestly claim. Still, her own words suggest that something has changed. For decades, Tanya's answer to pain was usually to keep moving. She performed when she was tired. She worked when her private life was unstable. She returned after the country industry had already begun treating her as part of its past. Now she appears to be asking a different question. Not whether she can survive another difficult year. She has already survived many. The question is whether she still wants the life that surviving requires. In a 2026 interview connected to the release of On My Way to Heaven, a recording and music video featuring Dennis Quaid and one of Chris Christopherson's final filmed appearances, Tanya spoke about being at a turning point. She mentioned the possibility of television work, a project about her father, and other ways of remaining creative. Then she spoke about touring. Roughly 200 days on the road, she suggested, may no longer be the life she wants. That is not a retirement announcement. Her official schedule still lists performances later in 2026, including state fair appearances. Fans should be careful not to turn uncertainty into a farewell that Tanya herself has not announced. But listen closely to the difference. She was not simply complaining about a difficult week. She was reconsidering the machinery that has carried her since she was 13 years old. You may remember Tanya as the teenager singing Delta Dawn, with a voice that sounded far older than she was. Or perhaps you remember the red leather, the tabloid romances, the years when Nashville seemed unsure whether to celebrate her or punish her. I remember something else in her recent comments, fatigue without self-pity. She did not present herself as defeated. She also did not pretend that determination can solve everything. And for Tanya Tucker, that may be the most unusual admission of all. Long before Tanya began questioning the road had already made most of the important decisions for her. In 1972, she was 13 years old. That number matters because the photographs can be misleading. In some of them, Tanya looks composed, almost defiant. Her voice created the same illusion. When Delta Dawn began playing on country radio, listeners heard regret, abandonment, and years of disappointment inside it. They were hearing a seventh grader. Columbia Records reportedly did not emphasize her age at first. The concern was understandable, even if it now feels uncomfortable. How would adults respond to a child singing material written from the perspective of women who had already lived through marriage, betrayal, loneliness, and loss? The answer came quickly. They bought the record. By the end of that year, Tanya was no longer simply a talented girl from a family that moved around the American Southwest. She was working inside a business that measured success weekly: chart positions, radio ads, ticket sales. Another song before the previous one disappeared. Her father, Jesse Bo Tucker, managed much of that early climb. Accounts of their relationship usually describe him as protective, ambitious, demanding, and deeply convinced that his daughter belonged on stage. All of those things may have been true at once. It is tempting to simplify him into either the father who created her career or the father who pushed too hard. Tanya herself has spoken about his influence with affection, frustration, and gratitude at different times. Family memories rarely stay in one category. What is clearer is that an ordinary adolescence became nearly impossible. In 1973, What's Your Mama's Name and Blood Red and Going Down reached #1 on the country chart. The following year, she recorded Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone, a song that drew attention partly because of its mature language and partly because Tanya was still only 15. At the time, controversy could sell records almost as effectively as radio promotion. But what happened after the headlines? That is harder to measure. You can count the singles. You can find the performance dates. You can watch footage of a teenager speaking to interviewers with the confidence of someone twice her age. What you cannot easily see is when confidence becomes a requirement. Tanya was praised for being fearless. The industry benefited from that image. Audiences expected it. Reporters returned to it. Eventually, the young singer may have had fewer and fewer places where she was allowed to be uncertain. I think that matters when listening to her now. At 67, she talks about exhaustion more plainly than she once did. She speaks about illness, limits, and the possibility that the old rhythm may no longer be sustainable. Perhaps age created that honesty, or perhaps she has simply reached the point where she no longer needs to perform toughness every hour of the day. The young Tanya was rewarded for sounding older than she was. The older Tanya now faces a different pressure, to keep moving as though age has changed nothing. By the late 1970s, Tanya Tucker had already spent years being introduced as country music's fearless young rebel. That description was useful. It sold records. It gave journalists an easy way to explain her. It also left very little room for anything quieter. In 1978, she released TNT. The album moved closer to rock, and its cover placed Tanya in red leather, staring directly into the camera. She was 19 when it came out, although the image seemed designed to erase whatever remained of the child singer people remembered from Delta Dawn. Some country listeners disliked the change. Others saw it as proof that Tanya was unwilling to remain inside the role Nashville had created for her. She later spoke about those years with a mixture of pride and unease. She enjoyed breaking rules. She also acknowledged that the attention surrounding her private life sometimes became larger than the music itself. That distinction matters. A rebellious image can begin as a decision. After enough years, it can become an expectation. People stop asking whether the person is doing well. They ask whether the next headline will be even wilder than the last. Tanya moved to Los Angeles near the end of the decade, partly with hopes of reaching a broader pop audience. The crossover did not unfold exactly as planned. What followed instead was a period she has described as increasingly shaped by alcohol, cocaine, nightlife, and loneliness. She did not blame one person or one event for all of it. In interviews, Tanya has often returned to the silence after a show. Thousands of people could be calling her name, and then a hotel room, another city, another morning when the schedule continued, whether she felt ready or not. That explanation does not excuse every decision she made. It does provide context. Then came Glen Campbell. Their relationship began around 1980, when Tanya was in her early 20s and Campbell was already an established star, more than 2 decades older than she was. Their performances together gave the public something irresistible. 2 famous country singers whose chemistry seemed visible before either of them explained it. Offstage, the story was far less controlled. Accounts from both of them describe substance use, arguments, reconciliations, and a relationship that became difficult to separate from the press covering it. Tanya later called Campbell the love of her life. Campbell, in later recollections, described the relationship more distantly. What happened depends partly on whose version you read. There were allegations of physical violence. Tanya filed a lawsuit after claiming Campbell struck her and damaged one of her teeth. Their engagement ended, and the relationship collapsed after roughly a year. It would be easy to frame this as the moment everything went wrong. Real lives rarely offer such a clean dividing line. Tanya was already under pressure before Glen. Her substance use did not disappear when he left, and the emotional meaning of that relationship seems to have changed depending on when she was asked about it. Years later, after Campbell developed Alzheimer's disease and then died in 2017, Tanya still spoke about him with visible feeling. Not because the relationship had become simple in memory, perhaps because it never did. The years after Glen Campbell did not immediately produce the kind of recovery people like to place in biographies. There was no single morning when Tanya woke up, understood everything, and began again. Her career weakened. The records became less consistent. Nashville, which had celebrated her as a teenager, now seemed uncertain about what to do with a woman in her 20s whose name had become connected to drugs, alcohol, lawsuits, and public relationships. Her father noticed it before she was ready to admit it. When Bo Tucker helped move her back from California, he reportedly told her that the reputation surrounding her had become an obstacle. Record companies were no longer hearing only the voice. They were also seeing the headlines. That must have been difficult to accept. Tanya had been working professionally since 13. She had spent most of her adolescence being told that she was unusually mature, unusually tough, unusually capable of handling pressure. Then, while she was still young by almost any normal standard, parts of the industry began treating her as damaged goods. There is something unsettling about that. The same business that had profited from her growing up too quickly appeared surprised when the consequences became visible. Tanya continued using cocaine and drinking heavily through much of the 1980s. The exact sequence of attempts to stop is not always described consistently. What is known is that her family eventually intervened, and in 1988 she entered the Betty Ford Center in California. Treatment did not erase what had happened before it. It gave her a chance to live beyond it. Around the same period, her career began moving again. One Love at a Time reached the country top 5 in 1986. Just Another Love became a #1 hit, and by the end of the decade she had returned to country radio with songs such as If It Don't Come Easy and Strong Enough to Bend. The comeback was real, but it was not clean. That is important. Recovery stories are often edited until the difficult parts form a straight line toward success. Tanya's did not. She continued dealing with personal instability, changing relationships, public judgment, and the ordinary strain of trying to remain sober in an industry built around late nights and constant travel. Then motherhood entered her life. Her daughter Presley was born in 1989. Her son Bo followed in 1991. On the same night, Tanya received the Country Music Association's Female Vocalist of the Year award. It sounds almost too perfectly arranged when repeated now, one of the biggest honors of her career arriving while she was giving birth. But even that moment contained a complication. Tanya was becoming a mother while still learning how to care for herself. She later had a third child, Layla, in 1999. She never married, although she was engaged more than once. At different points, the press treated that decision as evidence of independence, instability, or unfinished romance. Perhaps it was simply her life. She raised 3 children while continuing to tour, record, disappear from the charts, and return again. If you look only at the awards, the story seems triumphant. If you look at the years between them, it appears more fragile. And that fragility helps explain why her recent comments about slowing down do not sound like weakness. They sound like someone who has spent decades rebuilding and may finally be questioning how many times a person should have to do it. The most unexpected part of Tanya Tucker's later career is not that she returned. She had returned before, more than once in fact. The unusual part is that, after decades of being described as a survivor from another era, people began listening to her as a current artist again. Not as a museum piece, not as a name attached to old country radio, as someone who still had something unfinished to say. That change became visible in 2019 when Tanya released While I'm Livin', produced by Brandi Carlile and Shooter Jennings. It was her first album of original material in 17 years. 17 years is a long absence in any career. In country music, where tastes move quickly and radio formats change without much patience, it can feel even longer. Carlile had admired Tanya since childhood. Shooter Jennings understood the mythology around her too, but the album did not work simply because 2 younger artists decided to revive a legend. That version is too convenient. Tanya still had to enter the studio. She had to accept songs written with her life in mind. She had to sing words about death, regret, family, missed chances, and the strange experience of receiving love after spending years believing the industry had moved on. There was risk in that. An older artist can be honored so carefully that the music stops feeling alive. It becomes respectful, polished, and distant. While I'm Livin' did not feel distant. The wear in Tanya's voice became part of the record rather than something to disguise. Her phrasing sounded less interested in proving strength, Some lines seemed to arrive with hesitation, as though she understood them differently now than she might have at 25. Bring My Flowers Now carried the central idea most clearly. Do not wait until someone is gone to say what they meant. It is a simple thought, almost obvious. Yet it landed differently coming from Tanya. By then she had already lost her father, Bo, the man who helped build her career and who had remained tied to nearly every important decision of her early life. Her mother, Juanita, was gone too. Glenn Campbell had died in 2017 after living with Alzheimer's disease. Other friends and peers from her generation had disappeared one after another. So when Tanya sang about bringing the flowers now, the song did not feel theoretical. It felt accumulated. In January 2020, Tanya won the first Grammy Awards of her career. She had begun recording almost 5 decades earlier. She won for Best Country Album and Best Country Song, and the emotional reaction was genuine. For fans who had followed her since Delta Dawn, the moment seemed like overdue recognition. But awards can create misleading endings. The footage looks complete. Tanya on stage. Applause. Brandi Carlile beside her. The industry finally acknowledging what had been there all along. Real life continued the next morning. Recognition did not remove age. It did not erase the damage of the earlier years, restore the people she had lost, or guarantee that her body would continue tolerating the schedule that had shaped nearly her entire life. There were more achievements. A documentary, The Return of Tanya Tucker, followed the making of the album and brought her story to younger viewers. In 2023, she released Sweet Western Sound. That same year, she was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. From a distance, this looked like the safest and most settled chapter of her career. Then health began entering the conversation more openly. Tanya has said she is living with Lyme disease and the Epstein-Barr virus. She has not publicly provided a complete medical timeline, and that distinction is important. We do not know every diagnosis date, every treatment, or how her symptoms change from one month to the next. Anyone claiming to know exactly how serious her condition is would be going beyond what Tanya herself has disclosed. What she has described, however, is significant fatigue. One small moment stands out. Tanya said she had wanted to see Andrea Bocelli perform while she was staying close to the venue. The distance was not the problem. She was reportedly near enough that attending should have been simple, but she felt too sick to cross the street. There is no dramatic hospital scene attached to that memory, no public emergency, no announcement that her life was in immediate danger. That may be why the detail feels credible. It is ordinary. A person wants to do something small and familiar, then realizes the body will not cooperate. For someone who spent decades traveling hundreds of miles to perform, being unable to cross one street says more than a carefully prepared statement might. Tanya has also acknowledged that there were nights when she went on stage without feeling able to give the audience her best. That admission deserves some attention. Performers often talk about pushing through. The language is usually heroic. The show must continue. The audience should never know. Pain becomes proof of dedication. Tanya appears less certain about that idea now. She has spoken about spending roughly 200 days a year on the road and suggested that this pace may no longer make sense. That was not a formal retirement announcement. Her official schedule continued to list performances, and she discussed possible television work, new music, and a project connected to her father. So the future is not closed, but the old version of the future may be. There is a difference between quitting music and refusing to live inside the same exhausting machinery. Perhaps Tanya is still trying to understand that difference herself. You can hear it in the way she talks about what comes next. There is no clean declaration, no final tour speech, no promise that everything will continue unchanged. Instead, there are possibilities, fewer dates, different projects, more time at home, work that does not require waking up in another hotel room hundreds of times a year. And then there is Chris Christopherson. In 2026, Tanya spoke about one of his final filmed appearances, connected to the music video for On My Way to Heaven. She recalled how emotional he became during the recording. The precise meaning of that moment belongs to the people who were there. Still, it placed Tanya near another reminder that her generation is thinning. The men and women who once seemed permanent are now remembered through final recordings, old interviews, tribute performances, and stories told by the people still living. Tanya is one of those people now, not merely a performer but a witness. That may be part of what makes this stage of her life difficult to describe. Things are not looking good does not necessarily mean disaster. It does not mean Tanya Tucker is dying, disappearing, or preparing some secret goodbye. It can mean something quieter. The schedule is no longer fitting the body. The identity built around constant motion is becoming harder to maintain. The audience still wants the old songs, while the person singing them has changed. Tanya spent most of her life proving that she could survive almost anything: exploitation, addiction, public humiliation, career collapse, grief, and the long years when recognition seemed unlikely to return. Now the harder question may not be whether she can continue, it may be whether she should continue in the same way. And, at least publicly, she does not seem to have settled on an answer. There are still shows on the calendar, still music, still ideas. But there is also a woman who recently admitted that crossing one street was sometimes too much. Both things are true. For now, Tanya Tucker remains somewhere between them.